step into the dusty streets of Cedarwood Creek, where the scorching sun beats down on a frontier town caught between hope and heartbreak. In this rugged land of endless horizons and whispered promises, a single father yearns for a partner to help raise his children and rebuild the life that tragedy once shattered. But when his mail-order bride, full of dreams but harboring a heart-breaking secret, arrives by stagecoach, tensions flare and doubts cloud the air. Will her past heartbreaks and rumored infertility destroy her chance at love? Or can the single dad's children mend two wounded souls and bring them together? At last. The sun had barely begun its westward descent when the stagecoach rattled into Cedarwood Creek, a small frontier town that owed its existence to the copper mines and the occasional gold rush rumor. Dust billowed in every direction as the driver pulled the reins, bringing the horses to a hard, trembling halt. One of the passengers, a woman named Abigail Turner, clutched her purse, her heart pounding as hard as any hooves. Abigail had been on the road for weeks. She felt the sting of countless miles and days that bled into nights while sleeping against dusty seats. Now, as she tentatively lifted her head to peer out the window, an unsettling mix of hope and dread coursed through her. This was the moment her life was supposed to change for the better. She had come with a contract in her trunk and a promise in her heart, a promise that she might finally find a place to belong. She stepped out of the stagecoach. The midday heat made the wooden boards underfoot nearly sizzle, and the acrid smell of horse sweat hung in the air. Her travel-weary eyes darted around, searching for Thomas Morgan, the man who had written her letters so faithfully over the last few months. Each letter had been carefully composed, polite, sincere, and with an undercurrent of urgency. A widower with 2 children, he sought a companion who was kind, God-fearing, and eager for a fresh start. Abigail recalled his carefully penned words. She was desperate enough to become a mail-order bride, in large part because she had no other prospects left in Boston, a city that had once embraced her with promise, but turned cold and bitter after life's cruel twists. Her hopes soared when she saw a tall, broad-shouldered man approach. He walked with a purposeful stride, tipping his hat at ladies who passed, occasionally adjusting the leather vest that seemed a second skin on him. Thomas Morgan. She recognized him at once from the faded photograph he'd sent. His strong jaw and kind if wary eyes were unmistakable. He caught sight of her, and for a moment neither said a word, though each recognized the other from those letters. A small swirl of excitement tightened Abigail's stomach. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was the dawn of a new chance at love and family. Thomas was as stoic as she expected, the lines of his face shaped by the merciless sun and the heartbreak of losing his wife in childbirth 2 years prior. "Abigail Turner?" he asked, voice low and deep. She managed a nervous smile. "That's me. I'm Thomas Morgan. Pleased to finally meet you in person. Let me help with your luggage." The trunk she carried was battered and heavy, containing all that remained of her old life. A few clothing items, her mother's worn Bible, and letters from a time when the future looked brighter. Thomas lifted it with ease and motioned for her to follow him toward a buckboard wagon. When they reached his waiting children, her heart softened at the sight. Sarah, a slender young girl of 10, and James, 6 years old, with big, curious eyes. They studied her the way children do, open, hopeful, and a tad fearful. She had heard so much about them. Sarah was bright, quick-witted, and protective of her little brother. James, who seldom remembered his mother, needed the warmth and affection that only a mother could provide. Abigail felt a sudden ache. She'd dreamed for years of having her own children to love, but circumstances had stolen that dream from her. They exchanged polite greetings, but the moment was laden with expectation. In the corner of her eye, Abigail noticed some of the townspeople had turned their heads. She felt their judgmental stares. In Cedarwood Creek, everyone knew everybody else's business, especially new arrivals like her, who'd been announced beforehand as the prospective wife of Thomas Morgan. Part of her itched to retreat into the anonymity she once despised in Boston. Yet here she was, forging forward in the path that might give her a fresh start. Thomas offered her a spot on the wagon's passenger bench and made sure she was settled before flicking the reins. The gentle creak of wood and the horse's slow clop became a lullaby of possibility. With every turn of the wheel, Abigail's future beckoned. She was determined to make the best of this arrangement, despite the secret that haunted her. She could likely never bear children. Settling into the Morgan homestead did not happen overnight. The house itself sat on a modest stretch of land south of the main thoroughfare, near a winding creek that gave the town its name. Rows of sun-scorched grass framed the rutted path, leading to a tidy structure with whitewashed walls and a small porch. It wasn't the largest ranch in the territory by any means, but it was home to goats, chickens, and a lone bay stallion named Hammer. Abigail's first few days were a whirlwind of household tasks. She assisted with cooking, helped Sarah with reading lessons, and tried to make James comfortable whenever he grew wary of a stranger in his space. Thomas was gone most hours tending to his duties in the copper mine, and sometimes helping maintain law and order as a part-time deputy under Sheriff Garrett, named after the famous Pat Garrett, who once was said to roam these lands, though no one was quite sure if that was true or just legend. Regardless, the job weighed on Thomas and kept him busy leaving Abigail to bond with the children. Yet a subtle tension hung between her and Thomas. He remained cordial always, with a polite question about her comfort, always tipping his hat as he left for work. But there was an underlying hesitation, as if he was waiting for something to go wrong, and it did not help that neighbors and passers-by sometimes gossiped about how Thomas had taken in a mail-order bride too quickly, or that she might be after his land and not his heart. Rumors multiply faster than rabbits on the frontier, and she felt the sting of it. One evening after supper, as the sun slipped behind the jagged horizon, Abigail ventured to the porch to find Thomas staring into the distance. He appeared deep in thought, a crease etched between his eyebrows. She approached quietly, her heart fluttering with an urge to reassure him. When he noticed her, he spoke in a low voice. "I want this to work, Abigail. I'm sorry if I've seemed distant. It's just that I have to be cautious. Sarah and James have been through so much already." She nodded, her own worries churning. She knew the day would come when she'd have to reveal she could not likely bear children. The thought of it brought a dull ache to her chest. "I understand, Thomas. I've read your letters, and I respect what you've been through. I only hope you'll find it in your heart to trust me." He glanced at her. Something pained in his eyes. "Trust is earned out here," he said quietly. "But I do want to try." For a fleeting moment, something warm sparked between them. But then, as quickly as it arose, it was gone, submerged beneath the weight of unspoken sorrows. As days turned into weeks, Abigail strove to find her footing. She discovered that James liked it when she braided his horse's mane with ribbons, even though he'd pretend not to care. She noticed that Sarah eagerly devoured any reading material about distant places, particularly enthralled by real-life stories of Wyatt Earp's time in Tombstone, or how Billy the Kid was rumored to have once hidden in a shack near Cedarwood Creek. The girl's imagination soared on wings of legend, and Abigail encouraged her curiosity. But not everything was smooth. Thomas, while never unkind, seemed to keep a part of himself tucked away. It was as though the memory of his late wife was a spectre in every corner of the house. There were times he'd find himself lost in thought eyes, drifting to a picture on the mantel, a captured portrait of a woman whose face, though sweet, had once been filled with life. Abigail perceived a man torn between the guilt of trying to move on and the necessity of providing for his children. One stormy night, a thunderhead rolled over the plains, lighting the sky with jagged bolts and hammering rain on the roof. As the children slept fitfully, Abigail found Thomas in the kitchen, pacing as if troubled by some inner turmoil. Lightning illuminated the room in periodic flashes, revealing the intensity in his expression. "Is something wrong?" she asked softly, stepping in from the corridor. She too struggled to rest in the tumultuous weather. He hesitated, then turned to face her. The flickering lantern light cast shadows across his features. "I spoke with Dr. Hargrove the other day. She mentioned your medical records." He stopped himself, mouth twisting in regret, as if he knew he was stepping into uncomfortable territory. Abigail's heart stuttered. "I see." He shifted his weight. "I don't pry into folks' personal details. But I heard something about your inability to have children." She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling tears threatened her. Hargrove was the only person in Cedarwood Creek she had confided in, forced by an emergency checkup after a dizzy spell. It never occurred to her that the doctor might speak openly, or that word might reach Thomas so soon. "It's true," she whispered. "I've had complications in the past. The doctors in Boston said it would be nearly impossible." Outside the storm raged thunder rattling the window panes. She sensed Thomas's inner conflict. He'd sought a wife who could help raise his children, perhaps even give them siblings someday. This revelation was a blow to the hopes he might have clung to. "It doesn't mean I can't be a mother to Sarah. And James?" Abigail, added voice, trembling with desperation. "They're wonderful children, and I already love them." He exhaled, stepping back as if reeling from a punch. "I don't know, Abigail," he began quietly. "I didn't realize, I never imagined." He paused, feeling the contradictory waves of sympathy and disappointment. "I should have known. Or maybe This is all so sudden." The silence was thicker than the storm-swept night. Abigail lowered her gaze, tears of anger and embarrassment welling. She had come so far, pinned so much hope on this union only to see it slipping away. "I'm sorry," she whispered, before quietly retreating to her room. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a radiant sunrise that glittered on the wet grass. Yet the atmosphere in the Morgan household was anything but bright. Thomas avoided meeting Abigail's eyes during breakfast. He mumbled something about having to check the mines early, took a hurried sip of coffee, and was gone. Abigail fought to keep tears at bay as she tidied up. Sarah and James, perceptive as children often are, sensed the tension. Sarah approached as Abigail hung laundry on the line, a timid question in her gaze. "Ma'am?" she asked, voice trembling. "Are you mad at Pa? You look sad." Abigail paused mid-snap of a sheet, forcing a reassuring smile. "No, darling, I'm not mad. It's just grown-up matters. Sometimes grown-ups get confused and have a hard time sorting things out." Sarah nodded slowly, uncertain. "Pa, he's always so guarded, ever since Ma died." She hesitated, then put her small hand on Abigail's arm. "He'll come around. We like you." Emotion welled in Abigail. She ruffled the girl's hair gently. "Thank you, Sarah. That means more to me than you know." Still, Thomas's reaction stung. She understood that many men on the frontier desired a new wife who could bear more children, helping hands for the ranch heirs to the land. But it hurt that the connection they seemed to be building might be dismissed so easily upon learning she might never give him another child. Over the coming days, she tried her best to remain useful, to show her warmth toward the children, but her interactions with Thomas became increasingly strained. He wasn't hostile, just distant, as if shutting himself off from the possibility of heartbreak. Sometimes, late at night, she'd recall how she ended up in this position, abandoned in Boston by a fiancé, who left her for a woman who could produce a healthy brood of children, cast aside as worthless. The label infertile echoed in her mind like a curse, haunting her even across the miles. Cedarwood Creek had an undercurrent of neighborly help and also neighborly interference. Rumors brewed in local establishments like the Rusty Spur Saloon, where men loosened their tongues over whiskey. The townsfolk gossiped about how Thomas Morgan's new bride might not be the real deal, or that she was infertile and thus worthless to a man seeking to grow a family. It was disheartening, but it was the reality of frontier living. One day, while Abigail purchased flour and sugar at Betsy's general store, she found herself cornered by Eliza Brewster, a local gossip with a penchant for stirring trouble. Eliza sidled up her bonnet ribbons, fluttering in the breeze. "Heard you and Thomas might be having a bit of friction," Eliza said, her tone dripping with faux sympathy. "Ain't surprising. Mail-order brides come with their own set of problems." Abigail stiffened, but her reply was measured. "I don't recall asking for your opinion, Mrs. Brewster." Eliza feigned a pout. "Well, I just want to make sure you're taken care of. Folks say you can't have children. Suppose that puts Thomas in a predicament." Abigail managed a withering glare, but inside she felt a tempest brewing. Before she could respond, a familiar voice cut in. "Abigail, there you are." She turned to see Dr. Hargrove, an older woman with steely grey hair and a kindly but determined air. She addressed Eliza with curt politeness. "Why, Mrs. Brewster, it's so nice to see you. Goodness, is that the time? Perhaps you should be heading home." Eliza fluttered, looking like a ruffled hen. "I was just—" "Have a good day," Dr. Hargrove replied, ending the conversation. Eliza huffed and departed. Once she was out of sight, Dr. Hargrove placed a comforting hand on Abigail's shoulder. "I'm sorry, dear. I know you confided in me about your medical issues. I promise I never told a soul. Small towns have ears like hawks. But if you need someone to speak with, I'm here." Abigail was grateful. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Thank you, Doctor. It's been complicated. Thomas and I are— well, I'm not sure if he wants to continue with the arrangement." Dr. Sir Hargrove gave her a sympathetic smile. "He's not a bad man, Abigail. He's just grieving, and men often think they have to keep up a strong front. Give it time, and don't give up on yourself." The doctor's words were a balm to her wounded spirit. Though the path ahead looked uncertain, Abigail resolved to stay. If not for herself, then for Sarah and James, who were already tugging at her heart. Thomas's uncertainty manifested in small, hurtful ways. He'd avoid discussing marriage arrangements. He no longer lingered in the kitchen at dinner. If Abigail tried to talk about the future, he'd gently but firmly change the subject. She felt her new life slipping through her fingers like desert sand. Meanwhile, in town, folks were making their opinions known. Mr. Crowley, who ran the blacksmith shop asked Thomas, in earshot of others. "So you're going to keep that new gal around or send her back east?" Thomas said nothing in reply, but the question dangled in the thick air, feeding the gossip mill. At the dinner table one evening, Sarah squared her shoulders and looked her father in the eye. "Pa, you promised us a mother. Are you going back on your word?" Thomas dropped his fork. An uneasy silence settled. James stared at his plate, wide-eyed, clearly picking up on the tension. Abigail felt her pulse spike, uncertain how to intervene. Thomas cleared his throat. "Sarah, mind your manners." He paused, wrestling with how to phrase his words. "Miss Turner is a fine woman, but we have some matters to figure out." Sarah's lips pressed into a stubborn line. "You're being unfair," she whispered, tears threatening. She rose from the table and fled outside. Thomas rubbed his temples, sighing heavily. "I'll talk to her." He stood up, leaving James and Abigail alone. A tangible sadness loomed over the table. James fiddled with his spoon, the corners of his eyes misty. Abigail reached over to gently rub his back. "It's okay, James," she whispered. "Your father loves you very much." When Thomas returned, his expression told Abigail the conversation with Sarah had not gone well. Frustration rolled off him in waves. He quietly announced he was turning in early, leaving Abigail to tidy up in silence. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard the faint sobs of Sarah drifting through the thin walls. The heartbreak enveloping the family was undeniable, and Abigail's own heart ached at her powerlessness to fix it. Things took a sudden turn one afternoon, when a loud alarm echoed from the copper mine. An explosion, a partial cave-in, had occurred. News traveled fast, and soon most of Cedarwood Creek was rushing toward the site to offer help. Women carried blankets and water, while men brought ropes, picks, and timber. Panic thrummed through the crowd as thick smoke poured from the entrance. Thomas Morgan was inside when the accident happened. Abigail's heart jolted when she heard, and she clutched Sarah's and James's hands tightly, promising them their father would be all right. The children trembled, fear etched on their young faces. Sheriff Garrett organized a rescue party, among them local men who were experienced with mine safety. Hours felt like days as they dug and hauled away debris. When at last they pulled Thomas out, battered and dust-caked but alive, Abigail nearly collapsed from relief. She rushed forward, wanting to wrap her arms around him, but she hesitated, unsure of her place. The children, however, broke free and threw themselves at their father. Thomas held them close, eyes misty with gratitude. Paramedics from a nearby fort's infirmary, along with Dr. Hargrove, helped treat the injured on site. Thomas had a fractured arm and several bruised ribs, but overall he was fortunate. Another man, a good friend named Henry Collins, had been trapped deeper and was still missing. The townsfolk whispered prayers that Henry might be found alive. Thomas, cradling his bandaged arm, locked eyes with Abigail. For a moment, gratitude flickered, and she sensed a shift in him, like something intangible had changed. Life and death in the West had a way of clarifying one's priorities after all. She offered him a relieved smile. "Thank God you're all right," she breathed. He nodded, breath ragged. I'm sorry, Abigail," he murmured, just before he was ushered away by the rescue team to set his fractures properly. She stared after him, that simple phrase echoing in her mind. "I'm sorry, Abigail." Was it an apology for the way he'd treated her, or for something else entirely? In the days that followed, the community worked tirelessly to restore the mine and rescue any remaining trapped workers. Henry Collins was found alive, but seriously injured. Meanwhile, Thomas convalesced at home, his right arm in a sling, his movements slowed by injured ribs. This forced him to rely on others, particularly Abigail, to keep the household running. Yet it wasn't all quiet recuperation. Unsettling news spread that the mine accident might not have been a mere mishap. Supplies missing suspicious individuals lurking on the edge of town. Some folks whispered the explosion could have been intentional, linked to outlaws trying to sabotage Cedarwood Creek's main source of revenue. Tensions rose, and Sheriff Garrett doubled patrols. As for Thomas, forced rest made him confront the swirling emotions he'd long suppressed. More frequently, Abigail found him gazing out the window or watching her with a softened expression. Often he'd open his mouth as if to speak, only to hesitate. One quiet afternoon, Sarah and James were busy painting wooden figurines in the yard. Abigail brought Thomas a mug of tea to help dull the pain in his chest. He accepted it gratefully. "I owe you an explanation," he began, voice rough. She settled in a chair beside him, heart beating fast. He chose his words carefully. "I married young Abigail. My late wife, Margaret, was my first love. When she died, giving birth to James, a part of me died too. I know life must go on, but I struggle with guilt, like I'm betraying her memory by trying to find happiness again." Abigail rested a hand on his uninjured arm. "It's not betrayal to keep living," she said gently. "I understand your grief." Thomas bowed his head. "And when I heard you might not be able to have children, I felt everything was slipping away again. Like God was punishing me for even wanting more. It doesn't make sense, but that's how I feel." Tears pricked Abigail's eyes. "That's not how God works, Thomas. Sometimes we carry burdens we don't understand. But I can be a mother to Sarah and James. I want to be, if you'll let me." Silence wrapped around them, broken only by the children's happy chatter outside. After a moment, Thomas pressed his lips together, nodded slowly. "Let's give this us a real chance," he murmured, a small flicker of hope stirring in his eyes. Just as life appeared to be smoothing into a hopeful path, trouble kicked up dust in the form of a letter. It arrived one blistering morning, carried by the post rider who made rounds once a week. Hand-delivered to Abigail, it bore the seal of Mr. Jameson Bradford, an acquaintance from her old life in Boston. She recognized the script immediately. Her throat tightened as she read the words. Bradford was the man who had once courted her, only to break off their engagement when doctors pronounced her infertile. The letter brimmed with flowery apologies, regretful admissions, and a plea for her to return east. It seemed that Bradford's subsequent marriage had ended abruptly, and he now realized the depth of his love for her. Abigail's first instinct was outrage, followed by a hang of old hurt. How dare he contact me now, after discarding me for my condition? She wanted to tear the letter into scraps and fling it to the wind. Yet a part of her hesitated. She recalled the life she once envisioned in Boston, a life of social soirees, comfortable city living, and the possibility of not having to face snide remarks in a small frontier town. Thomas was in the room when she opened the letter. He picked up on her troubled expression. "Something amiss?" he asked, stepping closer. Abigail, uncertain how to respond, handed him the letter. He skimmed it, his jaw tightening. "So he wants you back?" Thomas asked, voice controlled. She pressed her lips together. "I have no intention of responding." Thomas set the letter down gently. The tension in the room grew thick. "He's a wealthy man," Thomas said. "I'm sure he could provide you with a life of ease." "I don't care about wealth," she insisted, meeting his gaze. "He hurt me. I'm done with him." But something dark lurked behind Thomas's eyes, an insecurity that maybe he had no right to keep her in Cedarwood Creek when he himself had hesitated about her. The letter stirred up old wounds for them both, bringing the question of whether she was truly free to make her own choice or if destiny was sweeping her along again. Despite her assurance to Thomas, the letter's presence in the house lingered like a dark omen. It sat on the mantel for days untouched, but never quite forgotten. Thomas's mood grew grim. He feared that the worldly, wealthier Bradford might still hold a claim on Abigail's heart. Meanwhile, the townsfolk whispered of a love triangle fueling speculation. Matters escalated when a second letter arrived, this one from a law firm representing Bradford. It claimed that given her father's passing, Abigail had inherited a small estate in Boston. The letter strongly suggested that Bradford would help her manage it, providing a comfortable city life free of frontier dangers. Abigail nearly scoffed at the idea. She remembered well the heartbreak Bradford had inflicted. Over dinner, Sarah asked innocently, "Miss Abigail, are you leaving us?" The tremor in her voice twisted Abigail's heart. Even James looked frightened, big eyes blinking as he waited for an answer. Thomas froze, spoon halfway to his mouth. All eyes rested on Abigail. She set down her napkin and gently took Sarah's hand. "No, sweetheart, I'm not leaving. I promise." Thomas exhaled softly. A weight seemed to lift. I'm glad to hear that he murmured half apology in his tone. But a new problem brewed. Late one night as the family slept, Abigail thought she heard a strange noise outside the barn. Grabbing a lantern, she ventured out only to see a shadowy figure darting away into the darkness. At first she thought it might be a coyote or stray dog, but the next morning they found the barn door forced open and Thomas's prized stallion Hammer dangerously skittish, as if someone had tried to steal him. Alarm spread through the household. If outlaws were prowling around, the family's safety might be at stake. Sheriff Garrett was informed patrols were increased, but the sense of unease clung to the Morgan homestead. Amid these unsettled times, Thomas's injuries gradually healed. His arm was out of the sling, though he'd occasionally wince from a sore rib. Day by day, the partnership between him and Abigail seemed to grow stronger, even as outside forces tested them. One afternoon, after ensuring the children were occupied with chores, Thomas guided Abigail to the porch swing. The sun dipped low behind the mountains, painting the sky in swathes of orange and pink. She glanced at him curiously. He seemed nervous, his calloused hands fidgeting on his lap. "Abigail," he began softly, "I know I've been difficult, but I don't want to lose you. You've been a mother to my children in ways I can't even express, and a friend to me. More than that, I care for you." Warmth flooded her cheeks. "Thomas, He held up a hand, forging ahead with a trembling voice. "Let's make this official. Let's get married properly in front of the children and the town. I want to stand by you, no matter what the future holds, whether we have more children or not." Tears welled in her eyes. It was the proposal she'd longed to hear, but never dared to hope for. She gently placed a hand on his cheek, feeling the warm stubble under her fingers. "I'd be honored to be your wife," she whispered. A rare, radiant smile broke across his face, and he leaned in, pressing a tender kiss to her forehead. For a moment, all fear of bandit sabotage and Boston suitors melted away. In that sunset glow, they were simply two souls finding love in a harsh world. With a formal wedding set, excitement bubbled in the Morgan household. Sarah took it upon herself to make decorations from paper, while James hammered together a small wooden arch they planned to drape with flowers. Word spread quickly, and Cedarwood Creek readied itself for a rare celebration in a land often known for its hardships. But trouble brewed beneath the surface. Sheriff Garrett warned Thomas that the sabotage at the mine likely wasn't an isolated event. A local gang, rumored to be allied with a bigger outfit, led by a notorious outlaw named Randall Red-Eye Fulton, was spotted on the outskirts of the territory. Their motive was uncertain, but folks suspected they aimed to disrupt the mining operation for a cut of hidden loot or to strong-arm the townspeople into paying protection fees. Thomas, determined to protect his family, resumed his duties as a part-time deputy earlier than advised. Despite the healing injuries, he carried his revolver with renewed vigilance. Meanwhile, Abigail learned to handle a rifle under Dr. Hargrove's guidance, an odd but necessary skill for women in the West. The doctor herself was a crack shot, having learned marksmanship from her father, a Civil War veteran. All the while, letters kept arriving from Boston. Bradford's pleas grew more desperate, sometimes peppered with veiled threats about her financial future if she refused to return. Abigail showed them to Thomas, and though they stirred worry, both agreed to ignore them. Their life was here now. Among friends invited to the wedding was Henry Collins, now recovering well from the mine collapse. He and his wife Lydia offered to help with the food and arrangements. The atmosphere was hopeful, like a warm current cutting through the cold realities of frontier life. Just days before the wedding, a stagecoach rumbled into Cedarwood Creek, carrying an unexpected passenger, Jameson Bradford himself. Word spread like wildfire that a fancy Easterner had arrived wearing a fine, tailored suit and carrying a polished cane. He wasted no time checking in at the local boarding house and inquiring about Abigail Turner's whereabouts. When the news reached the Morgan household, Thomas felt his blood boil. He stood on the porch, fists clenched at the mere mention of Bradford's name. Abigail, for her part, was stunned. She never expected Bradford to travel all this way. What could he possibly hope to accomplish? That very afternoon, the man paid a visit. He arrived in a hired buggy, stepping down with an air of superiority that rubbed everyone the wrong way. Thomas moved to intercept him before he could set foot on the porch. Bradford Thomas greeted coldly, one hand hovering near his holster. "You have no business here." Bradford adjusted his coat, sneering slightly. "On the contrary, I've come to see my fiancée," he declared. "That's where you're wrong," Abigail said sharply, stepping onto the porch. She stood beside Thomas, heart pounding. "We're no longer engaged, and you know that." He tilted his chin regarding the simple ranch house with thinly veiled contempt. "Abigail, my dear, I've come all this way to offer you one last chance to return. You belong in Boston, not in this savage place." Thomas's jaw muscles tensed. He was about to retort when Abigail laid a calming hand on his arm. She faced Bradford directly. "You left me when I needed you most. Now you think you can waltz back into my life. I'm marrying Thomas. I love him, and I love his children. Nothing you say or do will change my mind." Bradford's face twisted with anger. "You're making a grave mistake," he hissed, "if you think this broken-down deputy can provide what you need." Thomas stepped forward, eyes narrowed. "I think it's time you leave." The tension crackled in the air. Bradford glared at them both, then snapped his cane on the ground in frustration, turning on his heel. "Very well," he said, voice dripping with venom. "I'll leave for now. But don't say I didn't warn you when you realize you've shackled yourself to a dead-end life." He climbed back into the buggy and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust and an unshakable sense of unease. In the aftermath of Bradford's abrupt visit, the wedding preparations took on a nervous edge. Abigail worried that Bradford might try something spiteful, and Thomas doubled his watch around the ranch. Sheriff Garrett, too, had reason to suspect Bradford's meddling. The man had all but threatened the soon-to-be Morgans. But beyond that, there was the growing menace of outlaw raids. Reports trickled in from neighboring towns that small gangs were extorting ranchers and businesses for protection money. Cedarwood Creek braced for trouble, and folks armed themselves. The days of wide-open front doors and trusting any passerby were drawing to a close. Still hope surged as the wedding date drew near. Sarah and James counted down the mornings, excited about having Abigail officially as their mother. They tried on their best clothes, practiced standing straight and tall for the ceremony. Every moment, Abigail's heart swelled with love for these children who had so freely accepted her, despite the challenges. On the eve of the wedding, Henry Collins invited the couple along with the children to his home for a celebratory dinner. Laughter and stories flowed amidst the flickering lantern light. Henry recounted a conversation with a certain Mr. Earp during a brief trip to Tombstone years back, boasting that Wyatt Earp had even complimented Henry on his draw speed, though some in Cedarwood Creek doubted the veracity of that tale. Nonetheless, it fueled a sense of excitement and legendary possibility, as if they too might carve their own heroic story in the rough-hewn West. That night, back at the homestead, Thomas and Abigail shared a moment under the stars. The sky stretched endlessly ablaze with countless points of light. "Tomorrow we'll be husband and wife," he murmured, pulling her close. "I want you to know I'm not marrying you out of obligation or pity. I need you. We need you." Tears brimmed in her eyes. "I've never felt more sure of anything," she whispered. The wedding morning dawned bright and clear, the air charged with joyful anticipation. Abigail wore a simple but elegant dress gifted by Lydia Collins and pinned wildflowers in her hair. The children dressed in their finest. Thomas, in a crisp linen shirt, black vest, and new boots, wore a look of reverent awe when he first laid eyes on Abigail. The ceremony took place in front of the small church. Friends and neighbors gathered, and Reverend Cole performed the rites. As Thomas and Abigail exchanged vows, Sarah and James stood beside them, each holding a bouquet of prairie blooms for their soon-to-be mother. Tears sparkled on more than a few cheeks in the crowd, for such a union represented hope in the face of adversity. But even on this day of joy, danger lurked. Just as Thomas and Abigail shared their first kiss as husband and wife, a shot rang out. Panic seized the crowd. Reverend Cole ducked and women screamed. Thomas immediately shielded Abigail, scanning the surroundings. Sheriff Garrett bolted toward the source of the shot across the street, where a masked rider brandished a rifle. Before anyone could react, the rider fired again, shattering a window behind the wedding party. A chaotic scramble ensued. Thomas drew his revolver, aiming for the shooter, but they wheeled their horse around and galloped away, dust swirling. Instantly, suspicion flared that the masked rider might be part of the outlaw gang, or even hired by the spurned Bradford. No one was injured, but the wedding's joyous atmosphere soured into alarm. Thomas gathered Abigail and the children close, heart pounding. The message was clear. Someone wanted to threaten them even on the most important day of their lives. Still determined to celebrate this union, the townsfolk rallied. After ensuring there were no more threats nearby, they continued the wedding reception inside the church hall. Yet the entire time, Thomas and Abigail wore haunted expressions, aware that their vow to build a life together was now tangled with a vow to protect each other from very real and imminent danger. An investigation quickly followed. Sheriff Garrett and Thomas spent long hours questioning townsfolk who might have seen the masked rider. Some pointed fingers at strangers who had passed through recently. Others whispered that Bradford was behind it. Still, the clues were sparse hoof prints in the dust shell casings that indicated a .44 rifle. Bradford continued to loiter in Cedarwood Creek, refusing to leave until he spoke with Abigail one more time. The man was an unwelcome presence. He'd swagger into the general store or the saloon, spouting off about civilized cities and barbaric frontier justice. Locals bristled at his arrogance, but tolerated him for the sake of not escalating an incident. Weeks passed without further attacks, but an undercurrent of tension remained. The Morgans carried on, adjusting to married life. Abigail poured love and effort into making the house truly a home. Thomas seemed more at ease, though he never let his guard down completely. One sweltering afternoon, Dr. Hargrove rushed to the Morgan homestead with urgent news. Henry Collins had overheard Bradford having a heated argument behind the boarding house with a surly man known to have ties to outlaws. According to Henry, Bradford appeared to be demanding results, while the man growled that the price just went up if you want intimidation. It sounded all too much like Bradford was indeed behind the wedding day shooting. Thomas's anger flared. He confronted Bradford in the middle of town, calling him out for the alleged hired attack. Bradford, playing innocent, sneered. "I've no idea what you're implying, Morgan, but if some savage gang is running amok, I'd sooner blame the poor security of your so-called law enforcement." The confrontation ended in a near brawl, with the sheriff stepping in to keep the peace. Yet the lines were drawn. Everyone suspected Bradford was the puppet master behind the masked rider. The question remained, how far would he go to forcibly win back Abigail or ruin her life if he couldn't have her? Late summer heat bore down on Cedarwood Creek, making days long and nights restless. One afternoon, Abigail was busy with chores inside, while Thomas worked outside, mending fences. The children had permission to play near the creek, as they did many times before. But something felt off to Abigail, a nagging worry she couldn't shake. She was stirring a pot of stew when Thomas burst in, eyes wild. "Abigail, have you seen Sarah and James?" She frowned. "I thought they were at the creek." "They're not there." His voice trembled with dread. "I searched up and down the bank, called for them. No answer." Panic clutched at Abigail's heart. They raced outside, scouring the property. Minutes turned into an agonizing hour, and still no sign of the children. Fearing the worst, Thomas saddled Hammer, while Abigail ran to alert Sheriff Garrett. An impromptu search party formed. Neighbors and friends fanned out across the dusty plains. Dr. Hargrove rode out with them, checking every nook and hollow. Thomas's mind raced with horrible possibilities. Outlaws, or Bradford. Could they have kidnapped the children? After an excruciating search, a shout echoed from behind a scraggly stand of mesquite. "They're here!" Henry Collins waved frantically. Thomas and Abigail galloped over hearts pounding. They found Sarah clutching James, both children, shaking with fear, pinned against a rocky outcrop. A tall, masked figure loomed over them, brandishing a pistol. Another man, similarly masked, spun around, startled by the search party's sudden arrival. A standoff ensued. Thomas raised his revolver, voice thunderous. "Let them go," one outlaw swore, cocking his pistol. But in that split second, Sheriff Garrett fired, hitting the gunman in the arm. The other tried to grab Sarah as a shield, but Thomas's shot forced him to dive for cover. The children scrambled free, running straight into Abigail's arms. The outlaws realized they were outnumbered. They retreated on horseback, leaving behind a swirl of dust and scattered footprints. Sarah and James sobbed uncontrollably, clinging to their parents, one as doctor. Hargrove checked the children. Sarah managed to gasp out what happened. They said they were going to take us away from Pa and Ma, if you didn't do what they said. Thomas and Abigail exchanged horrified glances. Bradford's cruel ploy to intimidate them had escalated. With his children nearly abducted, Thomas was done playing by half measures. Sheriff Garrett concurred. They needed to gather evidence, confront Bradford, and if possible arrest him for conspiracy with outlaws. But they lacked solid proof beyond hearsay, and the children's testimony that masked men threatened to take them away if you didn't comply. That evening, Thomas learned that Bradford was in the Rusty Spur saloon. Fueled by fury and a desperate need to protect his family, Thomas stormed inside. The place reeked of stale liquor and sweat, men hunched over card games, their eyes flicking up warily at the seething deputy. Bradford sat at a corner table, swirling whiskey in a glass, unaffected by the raucous environment. Thomas marched over, fists clenched. "You crossed the line, Bradford." The Easterner eyed him coolly, a sneer curling his lip. "I've no idea what you're talking about." Thomas slammed his hand on the table, making the glass jump. "You hired men to kidnap my children." Heads turned at nearby tables. A hush fell over the saloon. Bradford feigned offense. "Deputy Morgan, you have no proof of such accusations. Perhaps the savage outlaws in your region are simply out of control." Thomas's temper flared. He grabbed Bradford by the lapels, yanking him to his feet. "Listen here, you snake. If you or your hired guns come near my family again, I'll—" "Thomas." Sheriff Garrett's voice cut through commanding calm. He placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Easy. The law. We can't stoop to vigilante justice." Thomas released Bradford, breathing hard. Bradford, ever the showman, brushed off his jacket. "I suggest you keep your hounds on a leash." "Sheriff," he drawled, eyes darting maliciously at Thomas. "I'll be speaking with my attorneys about this harassment." Despite the overwhelming urge to thrash the man Thomas left under the watchful eye of Sheriff Garrett, the message had been delivered. But Bradford's cool composure made it clear he wasn't done. The next days were tense. Patrols were increased, and the children were kept under close watch. Abigail's nerves were frayed, sleep elusive. She often walked the perimeter of the ranch at night, rifle in hand, scanning the horizon for threats. Thomas, equally on edge, barely left the homestead except when on duty. Then one late afternoon, smoke appeared on the horizon. The mine was on fire, intentionally set presumably by the same outlaws. Sheriff Garrett's posse and many townsfolk, including Thomas, rushed to extinguish the blaze. Abigail stayed with the children, heartsick at the possibility that while everyone was distracted at the mine, Bradford's men might strike the homestead again. Her dread was not misplaced. As she peered out the window, 2 riders approached, faces obscured by bandanas. She quickly ushered Sarah and James into the root cellar, locking them inside. Adrenaline surged. She grabbed her rifle and positioned herself at the window. The men circled the yard, calling out, "We know you're in there, Mrs. Morgan. Come out and make it easy." One fired a shot into the air, sending the goats scattering. Abigail's heart hammered. She took aim, recalling Dr. Hargrove's lessons. The first bullet she fired shattered a porch post near one of the outlaws, surprising him. He dove off his horse, returning fire. Abigail dropped to the floor, bits of glass raining down as a shot smashed through the window. A tense exchange followed, bullets whizzing through the walls. Abigail's breath came in gasps, but she willed herself to stay calm. She had to protect Sarah and James. In a lull, she crawled across the kitchen, pressing herself against the wall. Her fingers trembled around the rifle. Suddenly, the sound of galloping hooves thundered outside. Thomas, flanked by Henry Collins, and two other men careened into the yard, guns blazing. One outlaw tried to flee, but was shot off his horse by Henry. The other found himself cornered, pinned between the posse and the house. Bradford emerged from behind a tree. Yes, Bradford himself, eyes blazing with desperation. He fired wildly at Thomas, shouting, "This all could have been avoided, Morgan, if she'd just come back to Boston." In the confusion, a bullet struck Thomas in the leg. He staggered, but Henry and the others returned fire, forcing Bradford into a corner. Meanwhile, the second outlaw tried to shoot Henry, but Abigail, stepping onto the porch despite danger, fired a precise shot that took him down. Breathing ragged, Bradford found himself facing the barrels of multiple guns with nowhere to run. He dropped his weapon. The madness ended as quickly as it began. Sheriff Garrett arrived moments later, placing Bradford and his surviving accomplice under arrest. The dust settled over Cedarwood Creek. The immediate threats were neutralized, and Bradford was taken into custody to face charges of conspiracy, attempted kidnapping, and attempted murder. News of his arrest sent shockwaves through the region. His claims of innocence fell on deaf ears, especially after the wounded outlaw confessed to everything, hoping for leniency. Thomas recovered from his leg wound with time and care, much to the relief of Sarah and James, who doted on their father constantly. Abigail's reputation in town soared. Folks admired her courage in defending her family, and any lingering rumors about her suitability as a wife vanished. She was undeniably one of them now, a frontier woman who'd proven her mettle. The Morgan household fell back into a more peaceful rhythm. Days were filled with chores, schooling the children and caring for Thomas as he healed. Even the land seemed calmer, as if reflecting the new sense of safety. The copper mine resumed operations, and though the scars of sabotage remained, the town found unity in adversity. One afternoon, Dr. Hargrove checked on Thomas's leg and gave a wry smile. "He's healing well, thanks in no small part to your vigilant nursing, Abigail." Thomas caught Abigail's hand, his eyes glowing with gratitude. "Yes, indeed. My wife saves me in more ways than one." They shared a tender gaze. The rocky path that brought them together had culminated in a deeper, unbreakable bond, forged by adversity and sealed with love. Months passed in peace as Cedarwood Creek healed. The ranch thrived, the children laughed more freely, and Abigail found deep purpose as a mother and wife. She had made peace with her past until sudden spells of dizziness stirred worry. Fearing a relapse, she visited Dr. Hargrove, whose smile held news that stunned her. "You're pregnant." Abigail was speechless. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Medicine isn't always right," the doctor replied. Tears welled in Abigail's eyes. At home, she shared the news with Thomas, who embraced her with a trembling voice, a miracle. Sarah and James squealed with joy. In that moment, the past's weight lifted. Abigail, once told she'd never bear children, now carried life. But more than biology, It was love, the kind forged in hardship and nurtured by trust, that had truly built this family. And now it would grow in ways they never thought possible. News of Abigail's pregnancy spread like wildfire, and Cedarwood Creek rallied. Women gathered supplies, baby clothes, quilts, and a cradle. Dr. Hargrove promised to oversee the delivery. The entire town, once skeptical of Abigail, now stood proudly beside her. Thomas was overwhelmed by the love surrounding them. He cherished Abigail with new devotion, marveling at how far they had come. Every day he thanked her and God for their growing family. Sarah took her role as big sister, seriously peppering the doctor with baby questions. James beamed with pride, declaring, "She's still our Ma," even with the baby in her belly. Meanwhile, Henry Collins helped uncover more evidence against Bradford, ensuring justice would be served. Life remained unpredictable with droughts and mine repairs still looming, but the Morgans and their neighbors faced it all with renewed strength and unity. Hope had taken root not just in their home, but in every heart around them. The day arrived with golden light as Abigail gave birth to a healthy baby girl, Hope. Her cries filled the Morgan homestead, a sound of triumph and grace. Abigail, tearful and radiant, cradled her daughter with awe. For so long, she believed motherhood was out of reach. Now, surrounded by love, she had it all. Thomas introduced Sarah and James to their baby sister, his face shining with pride. The children were overjoyed, pressing close to their mother and the tiny new life they already adored. Cedarwood Creek celebrated the miracle. Neighbors brought gifts, the church bells rang, and prayers were offered for a bright future. Even the land seemed to breathe easier. On the porch days later, Abigail leaned into Thomas as they watched the children play. Baby Hope slept in her arms. This was more than survival. It was redemption, healing, and the kind of love that only hardship can birth. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the dusty streets of Cedarwood Creek, where heartbreak turned to hope, and a family found itself bound by resilient love. From a single father grieving his lost wife to a mail-order bride once rejected for her inability to bear children. Life in the Wild West tested every ounce of their courage and gifted them the unimaginable. Fate and faith intertwined on a frontier that spared no one its trials, but rewarded those bold enough to keep believing in second chances. If this story touched your heart, inspired you, or simply swept you away for a while, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more captivating stories of hope, love, and perseverance to life. Stay tuned for our next adventure. And remember, sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones we never imagined possible.